If you're joining us for the first time, just to let you know, this room is, we're going to be keeping the replays on. So just know after I tell the story part of it, you're welcome to come up and ask questions or share thoughts or theories. This one's a heavy one. This is, again, one of those ones that I was like, maybe I should do a two-parter, but I'm going to try to get through it all in just an hour and a half. Hopefully we can, but there's a lot, there's a ton, not only because this is an older case, so there's a lot of stuff that we don't know still, but also because there's a lot of theories out there that they might have gotten the wrong guy. So I'll kind of go into that as well. But yeah, so if anyone doesn't know, this took place in Boston, which is where I currently am at this moment. And for one of the cases, actually, very creepily the murder took place literally 5-minute walk from my house. So this one hits home a bit, but it happened back in the 60s and it was a crazy time. I actually have spoken to my grandmother at this time and she shared how wild it was to be a woman in Boston at this time and constantly being worried about every time the doorbell rang, not knowing if it was a friend or if it was this guy at your door, because it got pretty hectic back then during this time. So, and another reason that a lot of people think that it could have been multiple people is because the victim pool is very diverse as far as ages, also race goes. And there was a lot of stuff being put out to the media at the time when the murders were happening that allowed for a lot of copycats to try to cover up their murders by just saying, oh, it was a strangler. So I'll kind of get into that as well. But first, I'll go through the first few victims. So the first victim of the Boston Strangler was on June 14th of 1962. It was 55-year-old Anna Slushers. She was a seamstress. Sorry, my dog. She was a seamstress for a decorating firm on Canal Street. She lived in a brick house apartment, 77 Gainsborough Street in Boston. It was behind Symphony Hall. She had a big passion for opera and symphony music, so it was kind of the best spot for her to be. She could hear it from her house. And so 5:30 that night, she had entered her apartment alone and she was getting ready because her son was going to be picking her up around 7 o'clock. She had a son named Uris, who was 23 years old. They were going to go to a memorial service at church for the victims of the Russian invasion of Latvia. She had opera music playing in the home and she decided to run a bath for herself. 7:45 p.m., her son came to get her. So he had come to get her around 7 o'clock when he had said he was going to come get her. But when she wasn't opening the door, he was banging on the door and he continued to bang on the door and yell her name for about 30 to 40 minutes. So it wasn't until about 7:45 that he was able to get into the apartment because he threw himself at the door twice and eventually broke the door to get into her apartment. When he got, also just a warning, heads up, a lot of these scenes are going to be a little bit graphic, so I will, I'll let you know before I get graphic. If you want to turn me down or pop out, don't worry about it. They do get a little bit graphic. So once he was inside, he found his mother. She was on the kitchen floor and she was in a house coat that had been torn up and it was exposing her. She had the cord from the house, and this is going to get graphic. The cord from her housecoat had been wrapped around her neck and tied in a bow combination of a granny knot, a square knot, and a double hitch knot. So I don't know too much about knots, but these are a couple of these knots you see in like boating, and then also one of them you see in boxing as well. So 3 different knots were used to tie her up and strangle her. So it had been clear that at first the killer had tried to kill her with a man's belt, but that had broke. And she had been assaulted with an object. So she had been sexually assaulted, but it was with an object and not a person. And that turns out to be the case with a lot of these cases going forward. The killer uses an object to assault them instead of himself. Her son said that she had zero enemies, and at first her son had assumed that it might have been suicide because he said that his mother was having a rough time lately. But once the police showed up, they said there's no way this had been suicide. I guess the son had thought that because she was found by the door, and because of the fact that she was strangled with the nylon socks, he thought maybe she had tried to throw herself up to the door to hang herself from there. When the police got there, they said there's no way this is suicide. Someone did this to her. Detectives James Mellon and John Driscoll were the first detectives, and they found the apartment completely ransacked. It seemed as if someone had completely trashed the apartment to make it look like a robbery, but there was nothing missing, and there was also nothing left behind. There was a gold watch and a lot of jewelry around the apartment that wasn't touched, so it just seemed to be a distraction. And also, they were like, it can't be a suicide. There's no note. And Detective Mellon had found drag marks next to the body, which he seemed to believe that she had been killed in the bathroom and then dragged into the kitchen and propped up that way so that whoever came in on her would see her propped up and exposed in that way. After this crime, they questioned a total of 8 men for the murder, but all were later released. The next victim number 2, was on June 28th. So this is just 14 days after the first victim. This happened on Commonwealth Avenue in the Back Bay. And the weird one about victim number 2 is that at first the police never linked this case to the Boston Strangler, but because later De Silva, the person that they arrested for being the Boston Strangler, he admitted to this one. That's why they added her to the victim pool. She was 85-year-old Mary Mullen, and she was found dead on a sofa in her apartment, and she didn't appear to be strangled. But De Silva had told the police that he went into her apartment to do what he had done to his first victim, but she got scared to death and had a heart attack. And it was confirmed that her cause of death was a heart attack. And so De Silva told the detectives that she died in his arms from being scared to death. Victim number 3 was the afternoon of June 30th, as this is just 2 days later after the previous one. This was Nina Nichols. She was 68 years old. She was a widow. She had just been stopping by her apartment to grab a bag because she was planning to go visit her sister in Wellesley later, and she was going to be staying over her sister's that night. It was really hot that night, so she opened her windows to let some air in. She got on the phone with her sister, and she told her sister that she planned to be at her place around 6 p.m. that night. And while she was on the phone with her sister heard her say, "Oop, there's someone at the door. I'll call you right back." And then she never called back, which is just gives me chills because I hate when that happens. Her sister mentioned to the police that she had heard a doorbell while she was talking to her. None of the scenes going forward, or actually any of the scenes, have signs of forced entry. So the person is likely being let into these scenes, and it's possible maybe he's posing as a maintenance man or maybe a salesman. So with Nina, when she didn't show up at her sister's place by 7:30, she called her brother-in-law Chester, and he continued to call Nina. And when she didn't pick up, he calls the superintendent of her building. And a little after 7:30 is when the superintendent finds her on the bathroom floor wearing a pink flannel robe that had been torn from the waist down. Again, it's going to get graphic. There was 2 stockings that had been tied around her neck in a bow, and they were tied so tightly that they had cut into her skin. Police found no signs of forced entry, and nothing was missing. She was sexually assaulted. This one, she was sexually assaulted with a wine bottle, and again, the entire apartment had been trashed to look like a robbery. She had fought, though, Nina Nichols, she fought back at the assaulter, and she did have skin on her fingernails that they did collect, but it was, and this was 1963, so this is kind of before they had the DNA to link that back to anyone. The next victim was actually on the same day. And there was a woman who lived underneath this 65-year-old woman named Helen Blake, who had a commotion that day, but assumed maybe something, maybe she was just moving stuff around. So this is June 30th, and Helen Blake was the victim's name. She normally had this routine where she would go to get her mail every morning with her neighbors, and she wasn't there that morning, but her neighbors assumed maybe she was just sick. Around 6 o'clock that night, her housekeeper went into her apartment and everything was a mess. Like the drawers were open, it had been ransacked completely. There was even spoiled milk on the counter. Then her housekeeper found Helen Blake. She was a nurse, and she was found face down, and the bottom of her flannel PJs were on the floor next to her, and two stockings and a bra had been tied around her neck. She had lacerations. The way that the killer had chosen to strangle the victims wasn't with his hands. He chose to use other items, stockings. He would basically compile stockings, bras. In one of the cases, he uses a blouse and what's it called? The thing, I forget what the name is, but like Spanx almost. He would compile these together and use them all together at once instead of using his own hands. And you'll see that going forward. So after this victim, after the fourth one, the Boston Police Commissioner named Edmund McNamara, he canceled all police leave and to get as much police as possible. And he sends out a mass warning to the media outlets telling all women to stay indoors and lock themselves in their apartments and to be very aware of their surroundings. And at the time, like I mentioned, my grandma has mentioned to me before what this was like. And it's also said that women would stay up all night just staring at the door because they were terrified, waiting for someone to break in or come in, and they just couldn't trust anyone, basically. It was a really rough time to be a woman in Boston, and even more so a single woman or single elderly woman in Boston. So, yeah, scary time. And also at this time, because it was the 1960s, they didn't have a name for serial killer yet. That wasn't around until the 1980s. So they had all this happening, but they didn't really know what to call it or how to profile it. They did have, psychiatrists coming in trying to examine, maybe we can put together a few things. And what they did put together was that the suspect had a bad relationship with their mother because it seemed that he was going after people that represented his mother. Victim number 5 was on August 19th. This was at 7 Grove Garden in Boston. This is in the west end of Boston. This was 75-year-old Ida Urga, and she was found strangled to death. She had immigrated to the U.S. from Ukraine with her 2-year-old son, and she had settled in Boston in the 1920s. So she lived a long life, and she was 75 years old, and it's just a terrible, terrible ending to a long, beautiful life where she had immigrated to Boston for dreams of a better life. So her son had even mentioned that she was worried about the murders, and he kept saying, "Oh, you're a smart woman. Just don't let anyone into your apartment." And so the day that she was murdered, she had gone out with friends and was supposed to be meeting up with her sister later on for lunch, and she didn't show up to lunch. So her sister called the superintendent of her building. This is an odd one because the superintendent of the building sent his 13-year-old son to go check to find out if Ida was okay, why this man sent his 17-year-old son instead of going to look himself. But then again, it was the 60s. Potentially his son worked there too, and he just didn't want to go do it himself. But if there's a bunch of murders happening, I wouldn't be sending my son to check. Whatever. Ida, when the son opened the door, he found Ida, who was posed specifically so that whoever opened the door would immediately be exposed to her and her genitals. It's going to get graphic again. She was lying on her back in a brown nightgown that had been torn down the front, and her legs were spread apart. Her legs were spread almost 5 feet apart, so very wide. And this was different because she was also propped up on a pillow, and that was basically so whoever found her would see that front and center. she had been strangled by a pillowcase and sexually assaulted. And on that same day, they found another body. The next body that they found on the same day didn't die the same day. She died a week before, but it took a while for anyone to find her. And this was victim number 6. And actually, on this day that both victims were found, the headline for that day read, "The deranged killer who has brought chilling terror to the home of every Boston woman who lives alone." So yeah, the media was going wild with it. There was a lot of tense stuff happening in the city at this time. So the 6th victim was 65-year-old Jane Sullivan. She was a night nurse at Longwood Hospital, and she was described as a beautiful gray-haired woman who looked much younger than her years. She was found halfway into her bathroom. She lived for 35 Columbia Road in Dorchester. So, like I mentioned before, one of these cases happened not even a 5-minute walk from where I am right now. That's this one. The police believed her killer murdered her in one room and then brought her into the bathroom. He then posed her because she was found face down and kneeling. Her head and her forearms were in the bath and covered by water. And she had a house coat on, pulled up to her shoulders, and underwear around her ankles, and she was purposely exposed in this way. She also was strangled by 2 nylon socks, and it was discovered that she had been dead at least a week. So this is the one that took a little bit to find. But the killer's still moving pretty quickly. Like, some of them are within a couple days, some of them take about a week. And so they had a psychiatrist come in and put together what they thought they were looking for, because at this point, all they really had was this: whoever the killer is getting into their house because there's no signs of forced entry. So potentially he could be posing as a salesman, or potentially he could be a maintenance man. But however way he's getting into these houses, he's not forcing himself in. The psychiatrist said that she also believed that he must have been he had an issue with his mother, like I mentioned before, and also believed that he was a psychotic sex pervert who would kill again if given the chance to. So that they weren't done. And then victim number 6 is again a woman that was older. And so this is where things start to take a turn, though, because up until this point they had a pretty good understanding of actually, let me PTR the picture of the victim for you. Before this, they had a pretty good understanding of who they may, or the who needed to be worried, who needed to be looking out for themselves, and all of that. I mean, every single woman in Boston was worried, but they had a good idea of who the killer was looking for. After this, victim 7 happened about 3 months later, so there was a break there. And this happened on December 5th in 1962. On this day, it was 40 degrees, so a lot different than the hot weather that the killer was going out in before. This happened to 21-year-old Sophia Clark. She was an African American woman and a student living in Huntington Avenue in Boston. She also lived with roommates, but they weren't home at the time. The odd thing about Sophie, she didn't go out a lot, and she spent a lot of her time at home studying. She also had a fiance that she spent a lot of time writing letters to. And this was an odd case because previously, like I mentioned, it was specifically elderly white women that were getting murdered. So the evening that her murder occurred, she was staying home writing a letter to her fiance, Chuck, who lived back in Jersey where she was from, and he had planned to visit her the next week, and they were both really excited about the visit. She was killed literally in the middle of writing this letter. The letter started out by saying, "My dearest Chuck, may this letter find the man I love well." So poor Chuck and Sophie, I just wish they could have had a life together because they were very much in love. And when she writes the letter, it's literally as she starts a new paragraph, she says "I," and then it just ends. So she was killed midway through writing this letter. Her roommate Gloria Todd had a habit of calling Sophie every day around 4:30, and that day when she called, she didn't pick up, and she called her around 4:15. She felt odd about it, so When she later came home from work around 5:30, she didn't immediately go into the apartment. At first, she knocked on the door because she felt so weird about the fact that Sophie didn't pick up. She knocked on the door and still Sophie didn't answer. So that's when she unlocked the door and immediately found Sophie. She was on her back and her legs were spread right open. It's going to get graphic. She was wearing a garter belt, black stockings, and a blue housecoat that were torn to expose her. And she had been strangled by a stocking and a petticoat that had been intertwined. On the carpet near the body were stains, and it turned out to be semen. So that was collected. And the saddest part about this one is that when Sophie had moved in with Gloria, Gloria had promised Sophie's parents specifically that she would look after her because Sophie was really worried about the murders that were happening around the city, and so were her parents. And Gloria was like, "Don't worry, I got her." But yeah, this ended up happening, so it's really sad. And also with Sophie, it was different because there was semen left at the scene, which wasn't at the scene at any of the other previous murders. So either it's that the killer is escalating, or it's that potentially maybe wasn't the same killer. And also because she wasn't assaulted with an object where before he was using an object. So now police don't really know what to make of it. They thought they knew who this guy was going after, and now they've got a whole different victim pool here. The people thought maybe she knew the killer because her roommate said she never would have let anyone into the apartment, not even a maintenance man. And there was a friend of Sophie's named Bob Payton who had taken Sophie out before and had been in the apartment before. And her roommates mentioned that it would be odd if she didn't know the person because she would not be wearing a house coat around a maintenance man or just somebody that came in. She would only wear that around her friends or people that she knew. So this man, Bob Payton, was seen in the apartment building the day that Sophie was murdered, and he had been knocking on people's doors. And one neighbor that he knocked on the door of said that he had asked her, he had told her that he was there to borrow a book from her husband, and the woman was just like, "No, you're not. No, my husband's not here. Don't come in." So she mentioned that he was very sweaty and kind of fidgety. So Bob Payton is one to look at, especially since this specific case is very much like out of the norm compared to the other ones. Victim 8 happened on New Year's Eve in 1962. This was 23-year-old Patricia Bassett. She was going to Middlebury College, and she was an editor for the yearbook there. And she also told a lot of people that she wasn't scared of the Strangler. She worked as a receptionist at Engineering Systems Incorporated in Kenmore Square. This one is also one that gets pointed out as being one that might not align with the others because the vice president of her company, Jules Rothman, showed up at her apartment, 515 Park Drive, to give her a ride to work. Why was the vice president of her job giving her a ride to work? I'll get to that. She didn't answer the door, and this Jules, the vice president, figured she overslept, so he went to work. And when she still didn't show up, he got worried and decided to call her. And then he ended up getting the janitor of her building to get him a stepladder so that he could break into her apartment because he was worried about her. From there, Jules opens the door for the janitor, and the first thing he says to the janitor is, "She's dead. She's got a stocking around her throat." When the janitor walks into the apartment, Patricia is found in bed in a bra and a blue and red house coat, and she had a sheet that had been pulled up to her chin, and it had been smoothed out very carefully. So her body was covered from her chin down. That's odd because the first thing that Jules says when he opens the door to the janitor is, "She's dead. She has a stocking around her throat." But the way that the police found her, they couldn't even see the stocking around her throat at that point, and Jules apparently had not touched her. So Jules is sus. Underneath this, she had been strangled with 4 pieces of clothing, a knotted blouse, a nylon stocking, and 2 stockings tied together in a bow. The medical examiner said there had been no signs of trauma besides the strangulation, but there had been signs that she had had sex recently. It didn't say if it was rape or not. It just said that there was sex. She had had sex recently. There was no signs of forced entry into her apartment, and she was 1 month pregnant. At first, the police immediately looked to Jules because he was married with kids and he was having an affair with Patricia. So that explains why he was going to pick her up that morning. And the police, when they tried to interrogate him, were trying to kind of rile him up. So they said things like, was she an easy girl to have intercourse with? And Jules would say, yes, that's the trouble with her. And the police were like, did she say no a lot? And he was like, well, not to me. So Jules kind of sucks overall. Don't like Jules. He was having an affair with his receptionist, his secretary, and he's over here saying it was because she was easy. So fuck Jules. They then start asking if he knew that she was pregnant, and he said that she had told him that she missed her period, and so yes, he knew that she was pregnant. And he also mentioned, Jules also mentioned that he had gotten in touch with his friend to ask about illegal abortions for Patricia. And then she ends up dead just a week later. So all of that is sus. And they were not able to keep Jules for this though. And they over time had to set him free to go back to his wife and children. So Jules very easily could have killed Patricia and just made it look like the Strangler, because all of this crazy hysteria is going on around the city. It makes sense to use that to your advantage. Victim number 9 was in March of 1963 in Lawrence, and this was 68-year-old Mary Brown. So again, now we're going back to the elderly woman. And she was found on the floor of her apartment with her head covered with a sheet, and she had been raped, strangled, and beaten. She had also been stabbed in her chest with a kitchen fork, and the kitchen fork had been left in her chest. Again, the police weren't sure if this was escalation or if this was someone different, because it did look like the other elderly cases, and because this one, she was covered, her face was at least covered, and so was Jane Sullivan technically, because she had been covered with water in the bathtub. It could still align. It could just be an escalation. And then later on, when they have DeSalvo, he did confess to this one and describe the inside of her home perfectly. Then we have victim 10. This happened in Cambridge. So again, with a lot of these cases, because Boston was a pretty massive city, it still is, there was different police departments covering the cases, which you had to kind of combine all of them together and to get all the facts straight, because he was going from Lynn to I think he was in Lawrence at one point, Cambridge, Boston, Dorchester. He's kind of jumping around. It's close, but because he's jumping around to these different areas, it's hard for them to kind of track which ones go with which ones. So this one was in Cambridge, and it was 23-year-old Beverly Salmons. They figured out something was wrong when she missed choir practice, and she was found on her bed, stretched out, completely naked, and she had been stabbed and strangled with her hands tied behind her back. So this one, again, is a little different, and this one also is a younger victim. There was 2 silk scarves and a nylon stocking that had been tied in a bow around her neck, but the strangulation was not the cause of death, because her hyoid bone was not fractured or was not broken. Her cause of death was the stabbing. She had been stabbed 22 times, and 4 of the times were in the neck, and 18 was in the chest. And it seemed as if she had been stabbed in the shape of a bullseye. And she had been raped. And police also speculated that maybe the reason that the killer didn't strangle her or wasn't able to was because she was a singer and she had very strong throat muscles. So maybe that they had tried to strangle her and it didn't work. So they chose to stab her. Victim 11 was on September 8th of 1963. This was in Salem. So again, jumping over to another city, which actually Salem is a little bit north of Boston. So that's a little bit of a drive. Evelyn Corbin, she was a 58-year-old divorcee, and people said she was very young looking as well. She was having breakfast with her neighbor, Flora Mayweather, and then she went home to dress and get ready to go to church, to get ready to go to Mass. And then she was going to be meeting Flora later for lunch, and she never showed up. So Flora got nervous, and she went back to her apartment. And when she didn't get a response, Flora had her own key. So she went in and found Evelyn draped over a bed with her right leg dangling, and around her neck were two stockings tied in a bow. There was a third one that was wrapped around her ankle, and there was underwear stuffed in her mouth, which was also different from the previous ones. This scene also had traces of semen. And then victim number 12 was November 25th, 1963. This was 23-year-old Joanne Graff. She was an industrial designer in Lawrence, and neighbors mentioned that she was a super quiet but very sweet girl. She was a Sunday school teacher. When she didn't come to dinner on Saturday or church on Sunday, they knew something was wrong. So they called police, and the police were the ones that found this body. They found her naked with a blouse that had been pushed up over her armpits, and she was exposed completely. There was two nylon stockings and a leotard that were tied in a bow around her neck. There was an eyewitness that saw a man walking around the building with dark green slacks, a dark shirt, and a dark jacket. The green pants I'm gonna bring up again later, so just remember that for this one. And then the 13th victim, who ultimately was believed to be the last victim of the Strangler, was January 4th of 1963. This was the youngest victim as well. This was 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. She had just finished moving into her new apartment that she moved into with two new roommates, and they got a job at this place called Filene's, which I believe was a department store. And her roommates also worked there. And they had all just moved into this new apartment. She was 19, just got to a new city, really excited to start this new life. Her roommates found her when they came home. At first they called for her and she didn't answer. And at first they figured like, oh, maybe she's not in, whatever. They started dinner, and it wasn't until a little bit later that they went in her room to check on her, and they found her in a sitting position. She was sitting up on the bed, back against the headboard, with two stockings tied in a bow, and she had been sexually assaulted with, this is graphic, sorry. She had been sexually assaulted with a broom handle, and there was a Happy New Year's card that had been wedged between her feet, which was like really just awful. And she is known to be the last victim of the Boston Strangler. So they have all these victims, and from here, the Attorney General of Boston, Edward Brooke, he formed together the Strangler Task Force. So he went and grabbed all of the detectives from all the different jurisdictions, put them together for this task force to try to figure out who this person could be. Along with this task force, they also, because they didn't really have a lot of leads other than, he has a bad relationship with his mother. He potentially is a salesman, maybe maintenance man. So they tried to grab clairvoyants to help them out. And a couple of the clairvoyants, just to mention, because one of them is very odd in how he picked up on things. Basically, there was one called Paul Gordon. He was a clairvoyant that had described that the killer would turn out to be a man named Arnold Wallace, who was a patient at the Boston Mental Hospital. And he had escaped on multiple occasions. And so he told the cops that it was this man, Arnold Wallace. And when they went to question him, Arnold Wallace did have some info about Sophie Clark's murder, but didn't have the right info about the inside of her apartment. So that was kind of just a distraction from that psychic. And then there was a second psychic named Peter Hercox. He showed the police his skills by basically, he kind of liked to show off. This man isn't think a psychic looked like. He was kind of like a Godfather-esque, like he would be smoking cigars while he was helping police with these murders. And he just had a very thick Boston accent. He was kind of just, you just wouldn't expect him to be a psychic, but he would show off by doing things like if the police officer showed up late, he would say, oh, he wasn't late because of car trouble. He was late because he was having sex with his girlfriend. And like he would describe it to that police officer and kind of show off and at the same time embarrass people. So he was an odd psychic. The police tried to get him to, basically link the murders with this man. So they gave him a letter that had been written by one of the men that they had suspected, and he said, completely accurately explained that The murderer would be a man that sold shoes and that had a pointy nose, and he had a scar on his right arm. And that's odd because it does turn out to be basically that case when it comes to Albert De Silva. So that was odd. But the thing about this psychic, Peter Hercox, just the reason I'm even mentioning him was because he left Boston just 6 days after the investigation and was later arrested for impersonating an FBI agent that was investigating the JFK investigation. So Peter Hercox, even though he in a way helped and he did potentially have these powers, he was not using them for good. So during this time of these investigations, there's a man, detective named Phil Dinatale. So he's basically the one that broke the case wide open. And if it wasn't for Phil, we probably wouldn't have a lot of the answers. And the reason for that is they went to and looked back on all these different men that might have been this strangler. And one of the ones that kept coming up was this man that they called the measuring man. In the late 50s and the early 1960s, there was a man who would go door to door selling women, basically, telling women that they had a future in modeling. So he would come into their homes pretending to be this recruiter, and he would measure them. And he didn't use tape measure to do this. He would use his own hands. He would wrap his hands around their waists, and eventually he would end up fondling them. And then he would try to sleep with them. And if they denied him, he would later sneak into their apartments, break into their apartments, and wait for them to come home and then assault them from there. On May 3rd of 1962, there was a one-day trial for this man, and he was tried for 8 counts of breaking and entering. And he was released in May of 1963. This man is Albert De Silva. The reason that they did not link Albert De Silva to the first few cases was because, according to court documents, Albert De Silva was in jail during the time of the first few murders, and he was in jail for the Measuring Man murders. And that's why they didn't look into him any further. But that was not the case. It turned out, and it didn't come about until this man, Phil Dinatale, broke the case because he went into the court records to try to figure out, all right, this man, De Silva, he's got everything we're looking for. And even still, there was a woman that went to her boss on January 8th of 1965. She went to her boss at the Mass General Hospital, telling her boss that there was a man that tried to rape her and basically tied her up, and that man was Albert De Silva. So with this lead as well, Denatali was like, this has to be our guy. So he goes back into the court records and literally went, like, this is back in the 60s, so they didn't have computers. He had to go to the court records, like down in the basement, and pull out all the papers and read the papers. And so he went and did all of that and found that actually when this happened, De Silva wasn't in prison, even though for this whole time they thought he was. He had been paroled. Basically, he had convinced the judge that he wasn't a creep, even after all of these break-in enterings, and he was able to get out early. So he got out just in time for. He had gotten paroled in April of 1962. This is just 2 months before the first victim was murdered, and that was in June of 1962. So very much could have done all of these things, but because the original detectives didn't look into him was because in their records he was in jail during this time. So we come to Albert De Silva as being the Boston Strangler. So a little bit about him. He was born September 3rd, 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He was one of 5 children, and he had a really fucked up childhood. That doesn't excuse anything he did. But he had a father who was a fisherman that was an alcoholic and a wife and child beater. He was very vicious to his wife. He would, on multiple occasions, knocked her out completely. He basically knocked all of his wife's teeth out and also bent her fingers back until they broke. And he would make his children watch as he did this to their mother. He also got his kids stealing by the age of 4, and later he sold both Albert and his 2 sisters to a farmer for labor. This, just as an aside, also with Charles Manson, he had also been sold from his mom for a pitcher of beer. So when they're sold to for labor because their parents don't give a shit about them, keep an eye on those ones. It was drilled into his brain that women were useless and they should only be used for sex or violence. And his first sexual experience in his life was with his own sister. His father basically taught him from a young age that you take what you want when you want it. And so that ties into what he started doing later with these women. And it is said that he was a very quiet man that didn't have a lot of confidence, but he did join the army at age 17. He was honorably discharged after his first tour for disobeying orders, but then he re-enlisted and served for a few more years, and he was stationed in Germany where he met his wife. In 1955, he was charged with molesting a 9-year-old girl, but nothing came from those charges. He also had 2 children, Karen and Michael, and all of his family was quite shocked to find out that what he was being charged on later on when that he was the strangler, because they said he was a very loving family man. He built forts for a lot of his nieces and nephews. Just they didn't see it coming at all. Apparently he worshipped his wife. He was very devoted to her and he treated her like gold. And he would always say that he never wanted to be like his father. But he had a very voracious sexual appetite. His wife said that he would get very frustrated after she had children, that he had to wait to have sex with her again. And he would want to have sex up to 6 times a day. And she just didn't have the time for it because she had to raise a family. So later on, they do end up divorcing, but it wasn't a bad divorce. They just basically just divorced, probably because he wouldn't stop bothering her about the sex all the time. this so Robert I mean sorry so Albert Silva is the measuring man, and he also had been known earlier for being the Green Man. He got this nickname because he would wear these jumpsuits, these dark green jumpsuits, and when he assaulted a number of women in November of 1964. So this man got 2 names before being the Boston Strangler. Yeah, so this happened in 1964. He was arrested for assaulting 4 different women, where he would break into these single women's homes and he would molest them or fondle them, and then he would leave them. So one of the reasons he stopped one of the last victims of this spree, was the woman looked him in the eyes and said, "If your mother could see you now, wouldn't she be ashamed?" And then he said, "Yes, she would." And he left and he didn't try again after that. But he did get arrested for that. So he also was sent to Bridgewater State Mental Hospital. Here he met this man named George Nasser. George Nasser had been in the mental institute for murdering someone, and he actually is still in the mental institute to this day in Boston. He's in his 80s today, and he did a lot of interviews about being with Albert De Silva in this institute and what they talked about. He mentioned that Albert De Silva did confess to him that he was the Boston Strangler, but the reason that he didn't want to go to the police was because he wanted to make sure he could get as much money from his story as possible. And that was basically his reason behind not confessing yet. But during this time is when good old Phil, had broken the case and figured out that he was out during these times. And he goes to interview Albert De Silva in this mental institute. And his lawyer had gotten there just the day before him. So he had lawyered up and he did not talk to De Silva, even though he did not talk to Phil, who was basically the one that broke the case. Confessed everything to his lawyer, Ethel Bailey, and that's how he ended up getting booked for these crimes. The way in which that they got him to confess for each one of them is kind of different as well. They got a hypnotist to come in, and they got the hypnotist to talk him through the murders, kind of get him in that deep state. And he did describe the murders pretty detailed as far as like the insides of the house and everything. But there were a couple of things that didn't always line up for him. He said that DeSalvo said that he had raped all the victims, all of the first victims as well, all 6 elderly women. He never mentioned that they were raped by objects. So that didn't line up to what was happening. Also, he could never explain why he did it or his motivation behind it. And they thought that through hypnotizing him, they would get those answers, but they did not. So he never really had a reasoning for it. He even said to the hypnotist, hopefully you can find out why I do it because I don't know why I do it. And another thing that people would say about DeSalvo was that he was a really big bragger and he kind of overinflated a lot of the stories that he would tell people. And so it is possible that he would read about these crimes and just kind of picture himself in those crimes. And that's why there was memories of it, or he did them. Either way, it was also speculated that it's possible that DeSalvo and his cellmate, George Nasser, maybe came up with a plan that they would both confess to the murders, and that way they would kind of, become famous in whatever way they could. So that was another theory that maybe they didn't do it, but we know that DeSalvo did do the Measuring Man assaults, and we know that he's probably linked to at least one of them because I think it's Mary Sullivan, because there was a man in a dark green jumpsuit that was seen in her area. So we know that for sure as well. But and the semen that was found at two of the crime scenes was also linked back to him. So we know that he did a few of them, but the first six where there was no semen at the crime scene and nothing was really left there, the fact that he said that he raped them and they were raped by foreign objects is odd. So yeah, so he was arrested for these crimes and he was put to death later on for these crimes. So that's the story of Albert DeSalvo. And that's basically the Boston Strangler case altogether. There's still questions about if they were all linked or if it was one person, and DeSalvo just wanted more money for his story. So, and also he wasn't, just to be clear, he wasn't going to get any money for his story. He wanted money to go to his wife and his kids, but they still didn't get anything because you shouldn't be making money off a story like that anyway. His plan of holding out to make more money didn't even work. And yeah, he's a shitty guy. I do have a picture of him. I'll PTR real quick, but he's, just imagine a Boston accent coming out of this face. Not a great time. But yeah, Danielle, do you know about this Boston Strangler case?
I had not. You've been doing a lot of cases I didn't know. I've heard of it, but I've never again researched in depth about it. But yes, that was wild.
Yeah, I know. And the reason that I think this one I went into the victims more as far as the crime scene is because it's important to kind of point out that mm, the media was basically what you had for news at that point. Was you had you had newspapers and you had the radio. You didn't have all the different media outlets that we have now. So a lot of what they were getting was coming from the media, and that was, the police were telling them what to put out there, but the police would leave certain things out. Like they purposely didn't tell them about the first six victims being assaulted by foreign objects. They left that part out. So later on, when people are confessing or when there's copycats, it makes sense that they are either doing it themselves or, that's what you can't really link. Is it an escalation of the original crime, or is it that different people are just taking the original crime and putting their spin on it because they don't know exactly how it happened the first time? So that's kind of why I dove into that a little bit more. And yeah, so it's just creepy. The whole thing is very creepy, that there is a chance that they may not have the right guy. They definitely have the right guy for a few of them, of course, because they linked his semen DNA back to those cases. But the other ones, he didn't have all the right answers. He did have an idea of what the apart. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention. His job was, he was a salesman that sold nurses' shoes, and a lot of the victims were nurses. The elderly women were, as well as a couple of the younger women. They were nurse techs at hospitals. So he did have a way into their apartments, and that worked as far as him being the suspect. So he could have easily done all of them, and maybe, but he would tell detectives that he had a photographic memory. So it is odd that he wouldn't remember the objects that he used each of the women. One of them, I definitely think the one that was found by her boss, that one I don't believe was one of them. I think that her boss just took that as an opportunity to cover up his own crime. Yeah, and freaking Jules, her boss, just gets to go home to his wife and kids, and the asshole. But yeah, if anyone wants to come up and chat about it, or if they have any connection to this case, or if they know anything, feel free to come on up. If you didn't know about the Strangler, this is back in the 60s. So this is kind of, there are a few books on it. I listened to a couple podcasts on it, and I learned a lot through that. And then I also did research, and there was a lot of stuff that I actually learned just about like strangulation in general, um, and like how that's different, and how it's process of murdering someone through strangulation is a lot more intimate, and that's why a lot of time it happens with sexual cases, sexual assaults, is because it's more intimate than just stabbing or shooting someone. And so I picked up a couple tidbits, a couple facts. So, with strangulation and associated with sexual murders, it's the cause of death in 67% of sexual murders. It's the cause of death in 63% of murders of elderly females. And it's 61% of sexual sadistic murders. It is all also found in 59% of serial sexual murders. I got that from the podcast Morbid. So, yeah, his cause, or the fact that he doesn't even have a reason for why he does it is terrifying as well. So this guy sucks either way. But whether or not he did all of them is still kind of a mystery to a lot of people. That's why they always say like the Boston Strangler or the Boston Stranglers, because there's a potential that there was more. But yeah, if anyone wants to come up, I know that that was a lot. That story part of it was a lot longer than I normally go, just because there was a lot of different parts to it, and there's a lot of different cases that are tied to this killer that might not be this killer.
Did you say that there was a documentary on it?
Yeah. Oh, actually, there was a documentary on it, and there's also a movie that was made about it. Like I think it was made in like the 90s or the 80s. But they're currently filming another movie about it, and they're filming it in the next couple months in Boston. And I believe Keira Knightley's in it, because when I first went to go research it, the first thing that popped up was basically, are you looking for this movie that they're making? Which I looked into a little bit, and it's interesting that they're making a movie now, just so happened to be the same time I'm researching the case, because they announced the movie like a day ago, or like literally just like there's articles about it a day ago. So that's that it popped up the same time. But there's a movie that they're making currently. They're filming it in Boston, so it will be out probably in the next year or so. And it has Keira Knightley in it. I don't know who they have playing the main guy, but look out for that. And there is a documentary. I forget the name of it. I think it's just called The Boston Strangler, actually. But yes, there is one out as well. But yeah, anyone want to come?
This case reminds me a lot of the serial killers that were in Louisiana. I believe around the same time there were like 5 different ones, and they kept mixing and matching and trying to figure out which one killed what victim. It was awful.
Oh no!
So I still think to this day some victims got pinned to the wrong killer, but it was wild that they had so many during that time period at the same time. And when you mentioned that the women, were afraid during that time, that is like always the same story, where the women are afraid and the men tell the women to stay inside and to stay safe, when it's them who is making us feel safe.
It's like we have to uproot our lives just to make sure some psycho doesn't get us, when it's like, what the hell?
Exactly. So yeah, it reminds me of that same hotel all the time with these cases where the women are petrified because they are the one who are the victims.
Yeah. It's like, look out because you live alone and you're a single female. But it's like, I shouldn't have to be afraid to live alone and be a single female.
Right. Exactly.
It's frustrating for sure. And also this one happened, because this happened in the 60s, I know it's weird to say that there was a wave of serial killers, but a lot of the ones that people talk about a lot were in like the late 70s, 80s, and then the early 90s, which were like, the Gacy and like the BTK and the Mads, and like all of those guys came about a couple years later. So this one really shook Boston up because they didn't even know. I guess I say like they didn't know about a serial killer because they didn't have the name serial killer, but I'm sure they had experiences where people would kill more than once, but they just didn't really know what to make of it. And they also didn't have a lot of the DNA tracking that we do now, so it was an extra layer of difficulty to track someone down or even connect the cases. So it makes sense that they have these outliers that they throw together a crime scene and be like, that was the strangler because they had a lot of the info in the media. But a lot of things that were in the media, they were getting wrong. So, and overall, like the cases that were tied to him were from 62 to 64. And there were a few breaks in between. And we know that he was put into a mental hospital. So that was where one of the breaks comes from for sure. But yeah, it lines up to De Silva pretty well, except for those little outliers, and then also for the fact that he didn't know all the details about the first few, which happened basically all at the same time. The first 6 murders of the elderly woman, they happened from June to August, and it was 6 of them. And then there was this break in time, and then they go to younger victims, and then it kind of goes up and down from there. So it's just strange that they're all getting linked back to him if they're kind of outliers, especially the one with her boss. That one should be a whole separate case altogether. I think it's pretty obvious the boss did it. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one too.
Yeah.
I was thinking that also.
Right. I mean, you're having an affair and then there's this killer going around. It makes sense that you would. And also, he's the one that found her. Like, please. He could have easily just like set up that whole scene and get to go find her later and be like, oh my gosh. Like, that's how it usually goes. So that one sucks that it got linked in. But yeah, all of these cases, all of them are just really horrific overall, and it's sad. And especially, well, I mean, any woman be murdered, but when it's elderly women, and then again, he would go to younger women. It's just very strange. The elderly women, I just think of like cute old ladies, and I just think that nothing should ever hurt them. And so sad.
That is so true. This is such another great room, Emmy. I would like to thank everyone in the club for coming, and we will see you next time.